Welcome, friends, and settle in close, for tonight we walk another of the tender roads, gently and without judgment, among the resting places of gifted and beloved people who left this world by their own hand. These are hard stories, and I will tell them softly, for the manner of a death is the least true thing about a life, and I will not dwell on it. What we come for instead is to remember who these people were, the beauty they made, and the laughter they gave, the long and private battles they fought so much more bravely than anyone knew, and to stand a moment at each quiet grave and say, too late, but with our whole hearts, that they mattered, and that they are not forgotten. The darkness that took them is an illness, real and treatable, and it is not weakness, and it is not selfishness, and it is not sin. It whispers to a suffering mind that its pain will never end, and that the world would be lighter without it, and both of those things are lies, and every soul we visit tonight is proof of it, for each left behind a light that still shines. That is the heartbreak at the center of all these stories, that people who seem to have everything, whose gifts brought joy to the whole world, could be so alone inside their own suffering that they could not see their own worth. So we walk not in gloom but in tenderness, letting their memory make us kinder to one another and to ourselves. If as we go you feel the weight of these stories, be gentle with yourself, and remember that the darkness lies to everyone it touches, and that no life is ever the burden it insists. We will visit 30 of these souls across the whole of our journey, 15 tonight and 15 when next we walk together. So lower your voice and take my arm, and let us go gently among them, beginning on the Illinois prairie, with a wandering poet who once traded his verses for bread. So lower your voice and take my arm, and let us go gently among them, beginning on the Illinois prairie, with a wandering poet who once traded his verses for bread. Let us begin at the Oak Ridge Cemetery in Springfield, Illinois, in the same green ground that holds Abraham Lincoln, to the grave of Vachel Lindsay, once the most famous performing poet in America. Lindsay was a singular figure, a troubadour of the prairie who in his youth walked across whole states with almost no money, trading recitations of his poems for a meal and a bed, preaching a gospel of beauty to ordinary people. His thundering, chanting, musical poems, meant to be performed aloud, made him a sensation, filling halls across the country, and for a time he was celebrated as a genuinely original American voice. But the exhausting life of the traveling performer wore him down. His popularity faded as tastes changed, money grew desperately short, and his health and spirit began to fail. In the winter of 1931, at 52, in the very house in Springfield where he had been born, he took his own life. He was laid to rest here, near the martyred president he had revered above all others. He believed, with a burning sincerity, that beauty and poetry belonged to everyone, not only to the educated few, and he carried that faith across the country on foot, sleeping in fields and barns, offering his verses in exchange for supper, a wandering evangelist of art. When fame finally found him, his performances were like nothing audiences had seen, half poetry and half revival meeting, his great chanting rhythms bringing crowds roaring to their feet. But the very thing that made him a sensation, the demand that he perform his handful of famous pieces over and over, came to feel like a cage. And as fashions in poetry turned against his booming, old-fashioned style, the invitations dwindled and the money vanished. Married with young children and sinking into debt and ill health, the once celebrated troubadour grew frightened and despairing in the little Springfield house where his life had begun, and where, at 52, it ended. There was something deeply, purely American about him. A democratic faith that art was for the farmer and the shopkeeper as much as for the scholar, and in his heyday he was mentioned in the same breath as the finest poets of his generation, his rhythmic masterpieces recited in schoolrooms across the nation. He idolized the martyred president whose town he shared, writing of him walking the midnight streets in a time of trouble, and it is a quiet grace that the poet now lies in the same ground as the man he revered. But greatness in performance is a cruel and fleeting kind of fame, dependent on the strength to keep traveling and the fashion of the moment, and when both deserted him, he had little to fall back on. He grew paranoid and frightened in his final months, convinced the world had turned against him, and the darkness that closed over him was as complete as his early hope had been bright. He rests here now, the prairie troubadour whose songs once filled the land. Let us travel now to the Forest Hills Cemetery in Boston, to the grave of Anne Sexton, one of the boldest and most original poets America ever produced. Sexton came to poetry almost by accident. A young housewife and mother urged by a doctor to write as a way through her breakdowns, and she discovered in herself a ferocious, fearless voice, turning the most private and forbidden truths of her life and her suffering into verse of startling power that won her the Pulitzer Prize and a devoted following. She was glamorous and magnetic and beloved by her readers and students. But the mental illness that had first driven her to the page never released her, returning in waves across the years no matter how bright her success. And in the autumn of 1974, at 45, it took her at last. She was laid to rest here in Boston, among other great writers. She had been a restless, unhappy young suburban wife and mother when a therapist, treating her for a breakdown, suggested she try writing down what she felt. And to everyone's astonishment, most of all her own, there poured out of her a torrent of extraordinary poetry, raw and intimate and utterly unafraid, breaking open subjects that women of her time were forbidden to speak of. She rose with startling speed to the very top of American letters, winning its highest prize, teaching, performing her work to spellbound audiences, a glamorous and charismatic literary star. But the illness that had first placed the pen in her hand was always with her, a lifelong companion of hospitalizations and despair. And though she wrote her way through it for years, drawing dark and shimmering art from her own suffering, in the end, the suffering proved stronger than the art. And it took her at 45, in the autumn, at home. She wrote about the female body and motherhood and mental illness and desire with a frankness that shocked and thrilled readers in equal measure, throwing open doors that had been bolted shut against women writers, and a whole generation of poets who came after her walked through those doors because she had forced them open. She performed her work like a star, in a husky, mesmerizing voice, sometimes backed by a rock band, filling auditoriums, trading letters and rivalries and friendships with the other great confessional poets of her circle, several of whom shared her affliction and, in time, her fate. But fame and acclaim are no cure for despair, and the hospitalizations continued through it all, the darkness never truly lifting, only receding long enough for her to write it down. She left behind 2 daughters and a body of work of blazing honesty and beauty, and she remains, half a century on, one of the most widely read poets her country has produced. To read her is still to feel spoken to across the years by someone who refused to pretend, who told the truth about pain and womanhood and love with a courage that changed what poetry could say. She rests here now, the poet who made art of her own darkness. Let us travel now to the Hollywood Forever Cemetery in Los Angeles, to the grave of Carole Dane, a silent film star undone by the coming of sound. Dane was a lanky, gangling Danish actor who became an enormous star in the silent era, unforgettable as the tobacco-chewing doughboy in one of the greatest war films ever made, his comic gifts making him rich and beloved across America. But when the talkies arrived, his thick Danish accent, so charming in life, was deemed impossible for the new sound pictures, and the studio that had made him a star let him go, and the offers simply stopped coming. His fall was swift and cruel, and he ended up reduced to running a hot dog stand on the sidewalk outside the very studio gates where he had once been a celebrated leading man. In the spring of 1934, at 47, in poverty and despair, he took his own life. For a few golden years, he had been one of the most bankable comic actors in Hollywood, his rubber-limbed, mournful, gum-chewing soldier stealing one of the greatest films of the silent era and making him a household name and a wealthy man, often paired with a small comic partner in a beloved double act. He seemed to have it made, but he had one fatal vulnerability, his heavy Danish accent, and when the movies learned to talk, that accent, which no one had ever heard while the screen was silent, rendered him suddenly unusable, and the studio that had made a fortune from him coldly cut him loose. The descent was staggering in its speed and its cruelty, from a mansion to a mechanic's bench to, at the last, a little hot dog cart set up on the sidewalk outside the studio gates, where former colleagues would pass him by. Broke, forgotten, and heartbroken. At 47, he ended his life, and the studio that had abandoned him paid, with a final irony, for his funeral. His was one of the first and most infamous casualties of the great upheaval that swept Hollywood when pictures learned to talk, a transformation that ended dozens of careers overnight, but few so completely or so cruelly as his, for his gift had been physical and visual, a genius of gesture and expression that needed no words at all, and it was undone by nothing more than the sound of his own voice. He tried everything to survive, taking any work he could find, a mechanic, a carpenter, and at the last, a vendor of hot dogs and cigarettes from a little stand pitched, with unbearable irony, right outside the gates of the studio where his image had once drawn millions. Some who passed did not recognize the ruined man in the great Starr. Some did, and looked away, alone and destitute and unable to see any way back. At 47, he ended his life, and the studio that had discarded him quietly paid for the funeral of the man it had made and unmade. His tragedy has come to stand for a whole vanished world, the world of the silent screen and the many gifted performers it made and then discarded when the technology changed beneath their feet, a reminder that even the brightest fame can prove heartbreakingly fragile. He rests here now, the silent star whom the sound age left behind. Let us travel now across the ocean to a cemetery in Rueil-Malmaison, near Paris, to the grave of Pier Angeli, a luminous Italian actress remembered as much for A Great Lost Love as for her films. Angeli was a delicate, soulful beauty who won hearts on both sides of the Atlantic, a gifted young actress marked out for stardom. But she is remembered most tenderly for her romance with a legendary young actor, a love that the studios and her family are said to have torn apart, pressuring her into another marriage on the rebound, after which, the story goes, neither she nor he ever fully recovered. Her career cooled, her marriages failed, and a deep depression settled over her. In the autumn of 1971, at just 39, she took her own life in Beverly Hills. She was carried across the ocean to rest in France. She had come from Italy as a teenager and captivated Hollywood almost at once, a fragile, dark-eyed beauty of real talent who won awards and seemed poised for lasting stardom, cast opposite some of the biggest leading men of the day. But her heart, the story has always gone, belonged to a young actor who was becoming a legend, and their tender romance was said to have been broken apart by disapproving forces around them, her studio and her family, who pushed her toward a hastier marriage. And when that young man died soon after in the crash that made him immortal, something in her was said never to have healed. Her marriages brought her little happiness. Her once bright career faded into smaller and smaller roles, and a deep depression took hold. In the autumn of 1971, at just 39, she took her own life, and those who remembered the old love story wept for her twice over. She had a fragile, spiritual quality that set her apart from the glamorous stars around her, and for a few years she was genuinely celebrated, winning a major award for a very early role and holding her own opposite the greatest actors of the age. But the great romance of her youth, with a young man on the verge of becoming one of the most worshipped figures in film history, seems to have marked her for life. And when it was taken from her, and then he was taken from the world entirely, the loss cast a long shadow across everything that followed. Her marriages were unhappy. Her career dwindled as she was offered fewer and lesser roles, and the fragility that had always been part of her charm deepened into a serious depression. She spoke, near the end, of feeling that her best years were long behind her, that she had never recovered what she lost as a girl. And in the autumn of 1971, at 39, she took her own life. Her twin sister, also an actress, would speak for years afterward of the sorrow that had shadowed her, and admirers of the doomed young man she had loved kept her memory alive alongside his, two beautiful young people whose brief romance became one of Hollywood's most enduring and melancholy legends. She rests here now, the gentle beauty of a love that could not be. Let us travel now south to the Panteon Jardin Cemetery in Mexico City, to the grave of Pedro Armendáriz, one of the towering stars of Mexican cinema's golden age. Armendáriz was a magnificent, commanding presence, the leading man of his nation's greatest films, and a star in Hollywood and Europe besides, working with legendary directors and appearing, near the end, in one of the most famous spy films ever made. He was proud, vital, adored, at the height of a storied career. But he was struck by a devastating diagnosis, a terminal cancer that would only bring him long suffering. And rather than endure that slow decline, this proud man chose his own ending. In the summer of 1963, at 51, his homeland mourned a giant. He was laid to rest in the great cemetery of Mexico City. He was, quite simply, one of the greatest stars his country ever produced, the rugged, magnetic leading man of the classic films that defined the golden age of Mexican cinema, beloved by audiences across the Spanish-speaking world and admired far beyond it, so that a legendary American director cast him again and again, and he took his place, near the end, in one of the most famous adventure franchises in the world. He was a proud and vital man at the summit of a long and celebrated career. And then came the diagnosis that no vitality could overcome, a cancer that promised only a long, wasting decline. And this proud man, unwilling to let the illness take him slowly and rob him of himself, chose instead to meet death on his own terms. In the summer of 1963, at 51, his nation mourned the loss of one of its greatest icons and laid him to rest in the great cemetery of its capital. He had a face and a bearing made for the screen, proud and handsome and utterly commanding, and he used them to become the definitive leading man of his nation's cinema at the very height of its artistry, starring in luminous classics that are treasured to this day and carrying the pride of a whole culture on his broad shoulders. Hollywood came calling, and a legendary American director made him a favorite, casting him in celebrated films, and his fame spread across the world until he was appearing in one of the most popular adventure series ever made. He was, by any measure, a giant, but while filming years earlier in a desert location, he had, it is believed, been exposed to something that sowed a fatal illness in his body, and when the diagnosis finally came, promising only suffering and a slow wasting away, the proud man made his decision quickly and finally. In the summer of 1963, at 51, choosing to be remembered in his strength. He remains, to this day, one of the most revered figures in the entire history of his nation's cinema, his films still shown and cherished, his image, an enduring emblem of an era when his country's movies conquered the Spanish-speaking world, so that his countrymen remember not the manner of his passing but the towering artistry of a life fully and brilliantly lived. He rests here now, the golden star of a golden age. Let us travel now to the Waldfriedhof Cemetery in Davos, high in the Swiss mountains, to the grave of Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, one of the founders of modern art. Kirchner was a leader of the German Expressionists, a painter of jagged, electric, unforgettable scenes of the modern city, whose bold new vision helped to reshape the course of art in the 20th century. But he was a fragile man, already broken once by the horrors of the First World War, and when a hateful regime rose to power in his homeland and branded his life's work as degenerate, seizing and destroying hundreds of his paintings and casting him out of the museums, the cruelty of it shattered him. In the summer of 1938, at 58, in his mountain refuge, he took his own life. He was buried here in the Alpine Cemetery, near the home where he had made so much beauty. He had helped to launch one of the great revolutions in modern art, a founder of the bold German movement whose vivid, angular, emotionally charged paintings of city streets and figures shattered the polite conventions of the past and opened new possibilities that painters still draw upon today. But he was a delicate and haunted man, his nerves shattered once already by military service in the Great War, from which he never fully recovered. And when a monstrous regime seized power in his homeland, it turned upon modern art with special venom, and his work was among the first condemned as degenerate. Hundreds of his paintings torn from museum walls to be sold off or destroyed, his life's achievement declared a crime. The cruelty and the terror of it, the sense that everything he had built was being erased, overwhelmed his fragile spirit, and in his mountain refuge in Switzerland, in the summer of 1938, at 58, he ended his life. Along with a small band of fellow rebels, he had set out, as a very young man, to tear down the tired old academic art of the past and replace it with something raw and honest and alive, and the movement they founded became one of the pillars of modern art, its influence radiating outward for a century and more. His paintings of the electric, alienating modern city, all sharp angles and clashing colors and restless energy, captured the anxious spirit of his age like nothing before them. But he was never robust, and the trauma of the First World War had left him permanently fragile, dependent on the quiet of his mountain home to work at all. When the regime that had seized his country declared war on modern art itself, and his own paintings were paraded before the public as examples of everything to be despised and then destroyed by the hundreds, the assault on his life's meaning was more than his broken nerves could withstand. And in the summer of 1938, at 58, he ended his life. The regime that tried to destroy his work is long gone, and his paintings, far from erased, are treasured across the world. A quiet and total vindication he did not live to see. He rests here now, the master whose art a cruel power tried to erase. Let us travel now to the Montreux cemetery, on the southern edge of Paris, to the grave of Nicolas de Staël, one of the most admired painters of post-war Europe. De Staël was a Russian-born aristocrat by birth and a painter of thrilling originality, building his luminous canvases from thick, radiant slabs of color, at once abstract and alive with the light of the real world. And by his early 40s he had won enormous acclaim and a devoted following among those who loved painting. But he worked at a furious, self-punishing pace, tormented by impossibly high standards and by a private heartache, exhausting himself in a frenzy of creation even as doubt and despair closed in. In the late winter of 1955, at just 41, in the seaside town of Antibes, he took his own life. He was brought back to Paris to be buried. Born into a noble Russian family swept into exile by revolution, he had known upheaval and loss from childhood, and he poured all of his restless intensity into painting, arriving after long struggle at a style entirely his own, great architectural blocks of thick, glowing color that seemed to hold the very light of the Mediterranean, at once boldly abstract and tender toward the visible world. Recognition came in a rush in his final years. Exhibitions and admirers and soaring prices, everything an artist might dream of. But success brought him no peace, for he was a perfectionist, tormented by the gap between what he achieved and what he imagined. And he drove himself without mercy, working at a frantic pace while an impossible, unrequited love consumed him from within. Exhausted in body and spirit, in the seaside town where he had gone to work in solitude, in the late winter of 1955, at just 41, he took his own life. His journey to that late, luminous style had been long and hard, years of poverty and obscurity and grinding effort before he found the way of painting that was unmistakably his. Thick, radiant planes of color laid on with a palette knife. Canvases that seemed to vibrate with the light and heat of the southern coast where he loved to work. And when recognition finally arrived, it arrived all at once. A flood of exhibitions and sales and admirers that would have crowned most artists' dreams. But he was constitutionally incapable of satisfaction, forever tormented by the distance between the paintings in his mind and the ones on his easel, and he punished himself with an inhuman work rate while a hopeless love affair drained what little peace he had left. Sleepless, exhausted, and despairing in his studio above the sea, in the late winter of 1955, at just 41, at the very peak of his powers and his fame, he took his own life, leaving the art world stunned. His canvases now hang in the world's great museums and command the reverence of everyone who loves painting, the tragic brevity of his life only deepening the poignancy of their radiant, hard-won beauty. He rests here now, the painter of light who burned too fiercely. Let us travel now to the little town of Ricaldone in the Italian region of Piedmont, to the grave of Luigi Tenco, a brilliant young singer-songwriter whose death stunned a nation. Tenco was a serious and gifted artist, a pioneer of a thoughtful, literary kind of Italian popular song, admired for the depth and honesty of his music. In the winter of 1967, he traveled to a great national song festival to compete alongside the woman he loved. And when the jury eliminated his song from the contest, the public rejection, on such a stage, struck the sensitive young man as an unbearable humiliation. And that same night, at just 28, he took his own life. His death shook all of Italy and changed the festival forever. He was brought home to the village of his roots. He was a different kind of pop star, serious and intense and literary. A young man who believed that a popular song could carry the weight of real poetry and real feeling, and who wrote music of unusual depth and melancholy that earned him the admiration of those who took the art form seriously. He came to the great national festival that winter, not as a showman but as an artist, hoping to win a wider audience for songs he believed in, and singing beside the glamorous star who loved him. But the jury of that famous contest cast his entry out, denying it a place in the final. And to the proud and sensitive young man, the very public rejection felt like a verdict, not on a song, but on his worth, an unbearable humiliation before the whole nation. That same night, at just 28, he took his own life, and the scandal and the grief of it convulsed all of Italy and haunted the festival for generations to come. He belonged to a generation of Italian songwriters who were remaking popular music into something more honest and more searching, and he was among the most gifted and uncompromising of them, writing songs that refused easy sentiment and looked hard at love and society and the self. He had reservations about the glittering commercial festival even as he entered it, but he believed his song deserved to be heard by the millions who watched, and he sang it, that January night, with everything he had. When the results were announced and his entry was cast out of the competition, the public humiliation of it, broadcast to the entire nation, seems to have struck at something already fragile in him, and within hours, at just 28, he was gone. The shock rippled across the whole country and beyond, and the festival, and Italian music itself, were never quite the same, his death becoming a permanent scar on the nation's most celebrated musical stage. In the decades since, he has become a revered figure in his country, his few recordings treasured as the work of a true artist gone far too soon, and the festival that rejected him has never entirely escaped the shadow of that night, a permanent reminder of what can be lost when a fragile soul is judged too harshly before the eyes of the world. He rests here now, the young poet of song silenced too soon. Let us travel now to the Kiryat Shaul Cemetery in Tel Aviv, Israel, to the grave of Mike Brandt, a beloved singer who rose from the ashes of history only to fall too soon. Brandt was born in a refugee camp on Cyprus, the son of survivors of the great horror of the war, and from those beginnings he rose to become one of the most adored singing stars in France, his soaring voice and matinee looks making him an idol to millions. But the dizzying speed of his fame overwhelmed a sensitive soul unprepared for it, and beneath the adulation he was exhausted and increasingly desperate, sinking into a depression that his handlers scarcely understood. In the spring of 1975, in Paris, at just 28, he took his own life. His body was carried home to Israel, to the land his family had found after so much loss. His very beginnings were a story of survival, for he was born in a camp for refugees, the child of parents who had endured the greatest horror of the century and come out the other side with almost nothing, and he grew up poor and began singing in the nightclubs of the Mediterranean before a chance discovery carried him to Paris and, almost overnight, to superstardom. His powerful, aching voice and his romantic good looks made him an idol to millions across France and beyond, his records selling by the ton, his concerts mobbed. But it all happened too fast for a shy and fragile young man to bear. And the relentless demands of fame, the exhaustion, the loneliness at the center of all that adulation, ground him down into a depression that those around him failed to grasp. In the spring of 1975, in Paris, at just 28, he took his own life. His body was carried home to Israel, to the land that had sheltered his family. He could barely speak French when he arrived to seek his fortune, but it did not matter, for his voice needed no translation. A huge, warm, thrilling instrument that seemed to pour his whole soul into every ballad, and within a year or two, he had become one of the biggest recording stars in the country, adored, especially by young women who mobbed his every appearance. But he was, at heart, a shy and sensitive man, unmoored by the sudden, overwhelming machinery of stardom, and the loneliness and exhaustion and pressure of it all pressed down on him without relief, feeding a depression that grew darker and more dangerous while those around him, dazzled by his success, failed to see how much he was suffering. He had reached out for help more than once, but it was not enough, and in the spring of 1975, in Paris, at just 28, he took his own life, and a devastated public mourned an idol they had never truly known. His family carried him home to be buried in Israel. In France and in Israel alike, his songs are still sung and loved, and his brief, luminous career is remembered with a tenderness that has only grown with the passing years. He rests here now, the golden voice that rose so high and fell so fast. Let us travel now to the great Père Lachaise cemetery in Paris, to the grave of Gerard de Nerval, one of the most beloved and haunting of the French Romantic poets. Nerval was a gentle, dreaming, otherworldly soul, famous in his own day for his eccentricities, and cherished ever since for the strange and luminous beauty of his poetry and prose, which drew its dreamlike power from the very illness that tormented him. For he suffered episodes of a profound madness that he bravely transmuted into unforgettable art. But between those episodes, he sank ever deeper into poverty and despair, wandering the cold streets of the city he loved. In the bitter Paris winter of 1855, at 46, alone and unwell, he took his own life. He was buried here at Père Lachaise, among the immortals of France. He was one of the most singular figures in all of French literature. A gentle, unworldly, sweet-natured man, famous in the Paris of his day for his eccentric ways, and cherished ever since for prose and poetry of a rare, dreamlike, shimmering beauty, works that move between memory and vision, waking and dream, as no writer had quite managed before. And the source of that strange beauty was also his affliction, for he suffered from a serious mental illness, recurring episodes of madness that confined him at times, and that he faced with remarkable courage, even turning them into some of his most profound and haunting writing about the borderlands of the mind. But between the episodes, he sank into deepening poverty and isolation, wandering the freezing streets of the city he loved, with nowhere to go. In the bitter dead of the Paris winter of 1855, at 46, alone and destitute, he took his own life. He was beloved by the other writers and artists of his Paris for his sweetness and his oddity in equal measure. A man who was said to have once walked a pet lobster on a ribbon through the gardens of the city, explaining gently that it did not bark and knew the secrets of the sea. Behind the whimsy was a mind of extraordinary depth and a soul in real torment, for the episodes of madness that seized him grew more frequent and more consuming with the years, and though he faced them with courage, and even wrote a masterpiece about the descent into and return from that darkness, they left him exhausted and impoverished and increasingly unable to care for himself. His friends did what they could, but he slipped through their hands into the freezing streets, and on one of the coldest nights of that Paris winter, alone and with nowhere to go, at 46, he took his own life, leaving behind a body of work whose dreamlike beauty has only grown more treasured with time. Later generations of poets and dreamers would claim him as a forerunner, seeing in his fusion of dream and reality the seeds of movements that would flower long after he was gone, so that the lonely, impoverished man who died on that winter street became one of the most quietly influential writers in the French language. He rests here now, the gentle dreamer whose madness became beauty. Let us travel now to the shore of a quiet lake, the Kleiner Wannsee, near Berlin, to the grave of Heinrich von Kleist, a genius of German literature the world would not recognize until he was gone. Kleist was a playwright and storyteller of astonishing power, the author of dramas and tales now counted among the greatest in the German language. But in his own short life, he was largely misunderstood and unrewarded, racked by a restless, tormented spirit that could find no peace. In the late autumn of 1811, at just 34, in a sorrowful pact with a beloved friend who was herself dying of an incurable illness, he chose to end both their lives together on the shore of this lake. Only after his death did his homeland come to understand that it had lost one of its greatest writers. He was buried here where he died, and admirers make the pilgrimage still. He was one of the supreme geniuses of German literature, a dramatist and storyteller whose plays and tales are now studied and staged and revered as masterpieces, works of astonishing psychological depth and formal daring that were centuries ahead of their time. But that time was precisely his tragedy, for almost no one in his own short life recognized what he was, and he wandered from failure to failure, from abandoned career to rejected manuscript, a restless, brilliant, tormented spirit who could find no place in the world and no peace within himself. In the late autumn of 1811, at just 34, he made a solemn pact with a devoted woman friend who was herself suffering from an incurable illness, and together, by the shore of a lake outside Berlin, they chose to leave the world in each other's company. Only in the generations after his death did his homeland come to understand that it had been given, and had failed, one of its greatest writers. His plays and stories broke every rule of their day, plunging into extremes of passion and violence and psychological truth that his contemporaries found bewildering and improper, so that the very qualities that make him seem so astonishingly modern now condemned him to failure then. He tried desperately to find his footing in the world, in the army, in the civil service, in one literary venture after another, and everywhere he met frustration and rejection, his towering ambition forever crashing against an indifferent age, until a lifetime of disappointment and inner turmoil brought him to the edge. The pact he made was with a woman dying of cancer who no longer wished to face her end alone, and by the shore of that quiet lake outside Berlin, on a gray November day, the two of them left the world together with a strange serenity, having written farewell letters of unsettling calm. Within a generation, his genius was recognized, and today he is honored as one of the immortal names of German letters. Today his plays fill the great theaters of the German-speaking world, and students study his tales as masterpieces, the recognition he craved so desperately in life, arriving, as it so often does, only after he was beyond the reach of it. He rests here now, the genius the world understood too late. Let us travel now to the Rose Hill Burial Park in Hamilton, Ohio, to the grave of Ray Combs, a warm and beloved television host whose laughter hid a deepening pain. Combs was a gifted stand-up comedian who charmed his way into America's living rooms as the energetic, big-hearted host of one of the most popular game shows on television, bringing joy to millions of families night after night. But when he lost that beloved job, a cascade of misfortunes followed, a serious car accident that left him in chronic pain, mounting financial troubles, and the collapse of much that he had built, and a heavy depression settled over him that he could not shake. In the summer of 1996, at just 40, he took his own life. He was brought home to Ohio, to the town where he had grown up. He had clawed his way up through the hard world of stand-up comedy, a warm, quick, likable performer with a gift for putting people at ease, and that gift made him the perfect host for one of the most popular game shows in the country, where for years he presided over the laughter of ordinary American families with an energy and a sweetness that audiences adored. He was, to all appearances, a happy and successful man. But when the show changed hands, and he lost the job that had defined him, his fortunes turned with brutal speed. A serious automobile accident, leaving him in constant pain, his finances collapsing, his marriage strained, and a heavy, worsening depression closing in that his cheerful public manner had always hidden. In the summer of 1996, at just 40, he took his own life, and the many who had welcomed his smile into their living rooms were left stunned by the sorrow he had carried unseen. He had a rare and genuine gift for making people feel good, a quick wit and a warmth that came through the television screen and into millions of homes, and after years of paying his dues in comedy clubs, he landed the role that made him a household name, presiding with infectious energy over the joyful chaos of a beloved family game show. For a while he was living the dream he had chased, but television is a fickle business, and when the show was retooled and he was replaced, the loss of that identity hit him hard, and it was followed by a run of genuine catastrophes, a car accident that left him in relentless physical pain, business ventures that failed and drained his savings, the strain of it all fracturing his family life and feeding a depression that his upbeat public persona was expert at concealing. By the summer of 1996, the weight had become unbearable, and at just 40, he took his own life, leaving behind a young family and a nation of fans who had never guessed at his pain. His story became, in time, a quiet lesson about the distance between the happy face a performer shows the world and the pain he may be hiding behind it. A reminder that the people who work hardest to make others laugh are sometimes carrying the heaviest of private burdens. He rests here now, the cheerful host who carried a hidden sorrow. Let us travel now to the Chingford Mount Cemetery in London, to the grave of Justin Fashanu, a footballer whose courage cost him dearly and whose memory is honored now. Fashanu was a brilliant and pioneering athlete, one of the first black players to command a huge transfer fee in English football, a spectacular talent. And he made history as the first professional footballer ever to come out publicly as a gay man, an act of extraordinary bravery for which he was met not with celebration but with cruelty, abuse, and rejection that dogged the rest of his career, isolated and hounded, and at the end facing an accusation he despaired of ever disproving. He took his own life in the spring of 1998, at 37. In the years since, the world has come to honor him as the trailblazer he was. He had been a sensational young talent, a powerful and graceful striker who became, while still very young, one of the first black footballers in Britain to command an enormous transfer fee, his future seemingly limitless. And then he did something no player before him had dared, announcing publicly that he was a gay man, a revelation of extraordinary courage in a sport and an era steeped in prejudice, and for that honesty he paid a terrible price, met with abuse from the terraces, rejection within the game, and even estrangement from his own famous brother. The rest of his career was a long, wandering decline, and at the very end, far from home and facing a grave accusation he was certain he could not disprove, isolation and despair overwhelmed him, and in the spring of 1998, at 37, he took his own life. Only in the years since has the world honored him properly as the brave trailblazer who paid the price so that others would not have to. He had exploded onto the scene as a teenager with a goal so spectacular that people still speak of it. A powerful, athletic, charismatic forward who seemed destined for the very top of the game, and the record fee paid for him made headlines across the country. But his was a lonely and difficult path, for he was a black player in an era of open racism on the terraces, and, more isolating still, a gay man in a fiercely intolerant sport. And when he finally found the courage to tell the truth about himself, the backlash was savage, costing him the acceptance of teammates, of fans, and even, painfully, of his own celebrated brother. His career splintered into a long series of short stays at ever smaller clubs across several countries, and at the very end, alone and abroad and facing a terrible accusation he believed he had no way to fight, he came home to London and took his own life. At 37. Only in death has he received the honor he was denied in life, remembered now as a courageous pioneer who changed the game. Stadiums now observe his memory, and campaigns against prejudice in the sport carry his name, so that the courage that cost him everything has become, at last, a force for the acceptance he never knew. He rests here now, the brave pioneer the game failed in his time. Let us travel now to the Alva Cemetery in Florida, to the grave of Mindy McCready, a country singer whose bright beginning gave way to years of public pain. McCready burst onto the country music scene as a young woman with a powerful voice and a string of hits, including a #1 single, a fresh and promising star who seemed to have the world before her. But her life took a long and painful turn, through struggles with addiction, through abusive and turbulent relationships, through legal troubles and very public breakdowns. A downward spiral played out cruelly in the tabloids and on reality television. And when the man she loved died, the loss was more than her exhausted spirit could withstand. And weeks later, in the winter of 2013, at just 37, she took her own life. She had arrived in country music as a fresh and dazzling young talent, a beautiful girl from Florida with a big, bright voice, and her early records made her a genuine star, one of them reaching the very top of the charts, so that at first it seemed she had a long and golden career ahead of her. But almost from the beginning, her life away from the stage was turbulent and troubled, and over the years it unraveled in the harshest possible glare. Through addiction and through a series of damaging relationships, through arrests and custody battles and very public crises that the tabloids and the reality television cameras seized upon without mercy, turning her suffering into entertainment. She fought hard and loved her 2 young sons fiercely, but the losses kept coming, and when the man she loved died, her exhausted spirit could not survive the blow, and weeks later, in the winter of 2013, at just 37, she was gone. For a brief, shining moment, in the late 1990s, she was one of the most promising young women in country music. Her debut album, selling by the millions, her voice and her beauty seeming to guarantee her a long reign, and audiences embraced her as a fresh new star. But almost as quickly as the fame arrived, her personal life began to fracture in ways that would play out for the rest of her days in the cruelest public view. A long and harrowing succession of addictions and toxic relationships and legal battles and desperate low points, each one seized upon by a media culture that treated her unraveling as a spectacle for entertainment. Through it all, she clung to her love for her children and to the hope of a comeback that never quite came, fighting battles that would have exhausted anyone. And when the man she loved died suddenly, that final grief broke through her last defenses, and only weeks later, in the winter of 2013, at just 37, she was gone, mourned by fans who had watched her struggle for so long. Those who loved her music remember the bright promise of her early days and the warmth beneath the turmoil, and her story stands as a sorrowful reminder of how cruelly a public struggle can compound a private pain. She rests here now, the bright country voice that struggled so long in the light. And so we come to the final grave of this first half of our journey. Let us travel to the great Gloucester Cathedral in England, where the ashes of Isabella Blow are laid to rest within its ancient walls. Blow was one of the most dazzling and influential figures in the world of fashion, a flamboyant, brilliant, hat-crowned visionary who discovered and championed some of the greatest design talents of her age, plucking unknown geniuses from obscurity and making them famous while asking little for herself. She had an eye like no other and a generosity to match. But behind the spectacular public figure was a woman who battled a deep depression and a corrosive feeling that, for all she had given to others and to her industry, she had never been truly valued or rewarded in return. After a long struggle, in the spring of 2007, at 48, she took her own life. Her ashes were laid to rest in this magnificent cathedral. She was a figure the world of fashion had never seen the like of. An aristocratic, English, eccentric of wild imagination and fearless originality. Forever crowned in one of the extraordinary sculptural hats she made famous, and possessed of an eye for genius that amounted almost to second sight. Again and again she discovered raw, unknown talents and championed them with all her heart and her own money, plucking a penniless young designer from obscurity and making him a legend, doing the same for milliners and models and photographers, giving lavishly of herself and asking little in return. But beneath the dazzling, generous, larger-than-life exterior was a woman in real anguish, battling a deep depression and a corrosive sense that for all she had given, she herself had been passed over, undervalued, and left behind by an industry that took her gifts and moved on. After a long and painful struggle, in the spring of 2007, at 48, she took her own life. She had grown up amid faded aristocratic grandeur and private tragedy, and she turned herself into a living work of art, a fixture of the fashion world, instantly recognizable by her scarlet lips and the astonishing hats that perched upon her head like small sculptures, the creations of a milliner she had plucked from obscurity and made famous. That was her true genius, an almost supernatural eye for talent and the boundless generosity to nurture it, and the roll call of designers and models and photographers whose careers she launched or saved reads like a history of modern fashion itself. Yet she profited little from all she gave, and as she watched the geniuses she had discovered grow rich and celebrated while she struggled with money and felt herself increasingly overlooked, a bitterness and a deep depression took hold that no amount of dazzling public performance could disguise. She made several attempts to end her suffering before the last, and in the spring of 2007, at 48, she was gone. She rests here now, the visionary who gave the world so much beauty and so little of it to herself. And so, friends, we pause. We have stood tonight among poets and painters, actors and singers, an athlete and a fashion visionary, people of rare and shining gifts who brought beauty and laughter to the world and who were nonetheless overtaken by a darkness that lied to them about the worth of their lives. At every grave we have felt the same ache, the same wish that we could reach back and tell them what we see so clearly now, that they were loved, that their pain was not the truth, that the world was made richer for their being in it. 15 more of these cherished souls lie ahead of us, and we will walk to each of them with the same tenderness. Notice, as you rest, how little the darkness cared for the shape of a life. It reached a prairie poet and a Mexican film idol, a founder of modern art and a country singer, a genius unknown in his time and a fashion visionary adored in hers, and it found them across 2 centuries and half a dozen countries. In mansions and rented rooms and freezing streets alike, their gifts bought them no protection, and their fame, when they had it, too often made the loneliness worse. For it is a hard thing to confess to despair when the whole world insists you have every reason for joy. Notice, too, the love that surrounded so many of them even so, the friends who searched the cold streets, the families who carried them home across oceans to rest, the admirers who kept their memory burning long after. And notice, above all, what survived them. The poems and the paintings and the songs, the performances and the beauty and the sheer courage, gifts that outlived every sorrow and that we are the richer for holding still. So rest here a moment among these first 15, and hold them gently in your heart, and when you are ready, we shall go on together, remembering them, deeper into this most tender of roads. Welcome back, friends, and gather close once more, for our tender journey is only half walked, and 15 more of these cherished souls are waiting for us in the quiet. In the first part of our walk, we stood among poets and painters, actors and singers, an athlete and a fashion visionary, gifted and beloved people overtaken by that lying darkness we have spoken of, the illness that whispers to a suffering mind that its pain is endless and its life a burden, when neither of those things was ever true. We come now to 15 more, a grieving young painter and a haunted poet, masters of the short story and the novel, a composer and a wrestler and a wild rock and roll showman, an actress of the silent screen and a beloved old character actor at the end of a long life. Their fields and their centuries differ, but their stories rhyme, as all these stories do, with brilliance and with struggle, with a light given freely to others and a darkness borne too long alone. And so we walk on in the same spirit as before, with tenderness and without a shred of judgment, remembering not how these lives ended but how they were lived, and honoring the beauty each of them left behind. I will remind you once more, gently, that the illness which took these souls is real and, so very often, can be treated and survived, and that the tragedy of these particular lives is a call not to despair but to compassion toward one another and toward ourselves. If, as we walk, you feel the weight of it, be kind to yourself, and remember you are not alone, and that the darkness lies to everyone it touches. You may notice, in this second half, how many of these souls left behind gifts that outlived and outshone their suffering. Novels and poems and songs and performances that we treasure still, long after the pain that shadowed their making has faded from memory. And you may notice, too, how the darkness wore 100 different faces, grief and loneliness, and the fear of inherited madness, the crush of sudden fame, and the slow ache of fading glory, the wound of history, and the weight of an illness that had no name the sufferer could speak. Hold all of that gently as we walk. So take my arm again, and lower your voice, and let us go gently among them, beginning in Paris, with a love story that ended in the deepest grief. So take my arm again, and lower your voice, and let us go gently among them, beginning in Paris, with a love story that ended in the deepest grief. Let us begin at the great Père Lachaise cemetery in Paris, to the grave of Jean Hébuterne, a gifted young painter remembered for a love as tragic as any in the history of art. Hébuterne was a talented art student, quiet and dark-eyed and lovely, when she met a brilliant, doomed painter and became the great love of his life, his muse and his model and his companion, the subject of some of his most beautiful portraits. They had a child together, and she was carrying their second, when his years of poverty and illness caught up with him and he died. And Jean, inconsolable, 8 months pregnant, unable to imagine the world without him, took her own life only 2 days later, at just 21. In time she was laid to rest beside him. The two lovers reunited in the earth of Paris, their tragic devotion remembered ever since. She had been a promising painter in her own right, a serious and delicate talent studying art in Paris, when she fell wholly and irrevocably in love with an older painter of wild genius and self-destructive habits, and though her respectable family bitterly disapproved, she gave herself to him completely, sharing his poverty and his chaotic life and bearing him a daughter. She appears in some of his most tender and famous portraits, her long neck and downcast eyes and coil of auburn hair made immortal by his brush, the very image of quiet devotion. When his ravaged body finally failed him and he died, the world she had built her whole self around simply collapsed, and heavy with their unborn second child, unable to go on, she followed him within 2 days. Her grieving family at first buried her apart from him, but years later, relenting, allowed the lovers to be reunited, and today they lie together, their tragic romance, one of the most poignant tales the art world holds. For decades, her own art was almost entirely forgotten, overshadowed utterly by the fame of the man she had loved, so that the world remembered her only as a face in his paintings, a beautiful subject rather than an artist in her own right. Only in recent years have her surviving works begun to be shown and studied and valued, revealing a genuine and tender talent cut off before it could flower, a young woman who was far more than a muse. There is a special sorrow in her story, in a life and a gift subsumed so completely into another's, and then ended by devotion to him, and it is a small measure of justice that the epitaph on the grave they share honors her as his devoted companion, given to him even in the ultimate sacrifice. She was barely more than a girl when the whole of her world narrowed to a single love, and when that love was gone, she could not conceive of remaining. The image of her, waiting faithfully by the side of the man she loved through all his poverty and chaos, has become one of the enduring romantic legends of the art world, tender and terrible in equal measure. She rests here now, beside her beloved, faithful even unto the end. Let us travel now to the city of Basel in Switzerland, to the grave of Thomas Lovell Beddoes, a strange and haunted English poet who spent his life in the shadow of death. Beddoes was a poet and a physician both, a brilliant, restless, eccentric man who became fascinated, almost obsessed, with mortality and the macabre, pouring that fascination into a strange and gorgeous masterpiece he revised for decades, a Gothic drama shot through with unforgettable poetry. He wandered Europe as a kind of exile, unable to settle or to find peace, his brilliance shadowed always by a deep and restless melancholy. In 1849, at 45, far from his English home, in the Swiss city where he had come to rest, he took his own life. He was buried there, in Basel, an English poet in foreign ground. He had shown extraordinary promise as a very young man, hailed by some as a poet who might rival the great romantics, but he turned away from the literary world of England to study medicine on the continent, and there, among the anatomy theaters and the dissecting rooms, his lifelong fascination with mortality only deepened. For decades, he labored in secret on his strange masterpiece, a Gothic drama crammed with skeletons and ghosts and some of the eeriest, most beautiful verse in the language, revising it endlessly, never satisfied, never quite willing to let it go. He was a difficult, brilliant, unhappy man, quarrelsome and rootless, drifting from city to city across Europe, estranged from his homeland and, it often seemed, from life itself. In the Swiss city of Basel, in 1849, at 45, the melancholy that had always haunted him closed in for the last time, and he took his own life, leaving behind a wry and bitter final note. He has come to be seen as a kind of magnificent literary curiosity, a poet born out of his proper time, a belated Elizabethan wandering the modern world with a head full of skulls and blank verse, and his great unfinished drama, published only after his death, has haunted and delighted a small band of devoted readers ever since. Its songs of mortality among the strangest and most beautiful in the language. He seems to have been unable, all his life, to make peace with the world or with himself, a man of immense gifts and immense unhappiness who never found the place or the person that might have anchored him. His final note, addressed to a friend, was characteristically wry and dark, asking that a bottle of good wine be given to a doctor he named, and remarking that he ought to have been, among other things, a good poet. He was, and the tragedy is how little of his gift the world was allowed to receive before he laid it down. That so strange and singular a voice fell silent so far from home, in a foreign city with few to mourn him, only deepens the melancholy that clings to his memory and his verse. He rests here now, the haunted singer who courted death and found it. Let us travel now to the Jigenji Temple in Tokyo, to the grave of Ryunosuke Akutagawa, revered as the father of the Japanese short story. Akutagawa was a dazzling literary talent who, in a brief career, produced more than 150 exquisite short stories, tales of startling craft and psychological depth, among them the masterpieces that would one day inspire one of the greatest films ever made. So central is he to his nation's literature that its most coveted literary prize bears his name to this day. But in his final years he was tormented by anxiety, and by frightening hallucinations, and by a terror that he had inherited the madness that had afflicted his mother. In 1927, at just 35, overwhelmed by that vague unease about the future, he took his own life. He was laid to rest here in Tokyo. In a career of only a dozen years, he transformed the art of the short story in his country, and produced tales of such brilliance and variety that they are read and loved around the world, stories of medieval Japan and of the human heart, of pride and doubt and the slipperiness of truth. Among them, the two haunting works that a great film director would one day weave into a cinematic masterpiece. He was celebrated, admired, at the very summit of his nation's letters. But his mind was his torment, for his mother had suffered a devastating mental illness, and he lived in dread that the same darkness lay coiled within him, waiting. And in his last years, that dread was joined by real hallucinations, sleeplessness, and a crushing anxiety about the future that he could not shake. In the summer of 1927, at just 35, he took his own life, and his nation mourned a genius lost at the height of his powers, honoring him ever after with the prize that bears his name. He had been a sensitive and bookish child, raised by relatives after his mother was institutionalized when he was an infant, and that early shadow never left him, coloring his whole life with a quiet dread. As an adult, he was outwardly successful, admired, prolific, a central figure of his literary generation. But inwardly, he grew ever more fragile, exhausted by insomnia and stomach ailments, and a nervous sensitivity that the pressures of fame only worsened. In his final works, a note of terror and exhaustion sounds clearly, the voice of a man watching his own mind fray. The words he is said to have left behind, describing a vague and creeping unease about the future, have become famous in his country as an expression of a particularly modern kind of despair. He died young, at the height of his fame and gifts, and his nation, recognizing the magnitude of the loss, chose to keep his name alive forever in the prize that has since launched the careers of its finest new writers. He rests here now, the master of the story whose own mind turned against him. Let us travel now to the Hampstead Cemetery in London, to the grave of Charlotte Mew, one of the most original and haunting poets of her age. Mew wrote spare, intense, deeply felt poems unlike anyone else's, verses of longing and loss and hidden passion that won the admiration of the greatest writers of her time, who counted her among the finest poets then living. But her life was one of hardship and quiet suffering, spent in genteel poverty, caring devotedly for an ailing mother and a beloved sister, and shadowed by a family history of mental illness so frightening that she and her sister vowed never to marry for fear of passing it on. When at last her sister died, the grief and the loneliness were more than she could bear, and in 1928, at 58, she took her own life. She published very little in her lifetime, a single slim volume and a scattering of poems, but every line of it was wrought with such intensity and such originality that the finest writers of her day recognized at once that they were in the presence of a rare and true poet, and one great novelist declared her simply the best woman poet of the age. Yet her outward life was one of unrelenting hardship and self-denial, a genteel poverty born with fierce pride, an existence given over almost entirely to the care of others, her widowed mother and her fragile sister, while she kept her own deepest longings and sorrows locked away. The family was haunted by mental illness, two of her siblings having been lost to it, and she lived in the shadow of that fear. When her beloved sister at last died, the loneliness and grief were simply too much, and in 1928, at 58, she took her own life in a nursing home. She was a tiny, fierce, private woman who dressed severely and spoke little of herself, and who guarded her inner life with ferocious care even as she poured it, transformed, into her poems, which throb with a passion and a longing all the more powerful for being so tightly controlled. She knew great writers and won their deep admiration, yet she remained on the margins, poor and overlooked, refusing to trade on her small fame, taking on the endless, unglamorous labor of caring for her failing family. The vow she and her sister had made, never to marry lest they pass on the madness that ran in their blood, speaks to the quiet heroism and the quiet heartbreak of her life. A life of love, given and desire denied. When the last of the family she had cared for was gone, there was nothing left to hold her, and she slipped away into the darkness she had held at bay so long, leaving behind a handful of poems that ensure she will never be forgotten. That a talent so admired by the greatest writers of her day should have lived and died in such obscurity and want is one of the quieter injustices of literary history, softened only by the enduring life of her poems. She rests here now, the quiet poet whose small body of work burns so bright. Let us travel now to the town of Godalming in the English county of Surrey, to the grave of Peter Warlock, a composer of rare and delicate gifts. Warlock, whose real name was Philip Heseltine, led a strange double life, a serious scholar of old music and a writer of exquisite songs on the one hand, and on the other, a wild, hard-drinking, hard-living figure of legend, the two halves of him forever at war. Under his pen name he created music of great beauty, tender and melancholy song settings, and a beloved suite drawn from old dances that is still performed and loved today. But beneath the roistering bravado was a man prone to crushing depression, and in the winter of 1930, at just 36, that darkness overtook him. He was buried here in the Surrey town of his family. He was one of the most fascinating and contradictory figures in English music, a man who seemed to be two people at once. The sober, learned scholar who rescued forgotten music of the past from oblivion, publishing and reviving it under his own name, and the wild, notorious reveler who wrote ravishing original songs and choral works under a mysterious pen name borrowed from the world of magic. Under that name, he composed music of piercing loveliness, delicate settings of old poems, and a sparkling suite of antique dances that remains a beloved favorite in concert halls to this day. But the two selves could never be reconciled, and beneath both the scholarship and the roistering lay a man tormented by black moods and financial worry and a sense of creative exhaustion. In the last days of 1930, at just 36, in his London flat, that darkness overtook him, and he took his own life, leaving English music the poorer for a talent only half fulfilled. He was a figure of scandal and fascination in his own day, brilliant and charming and impossible. A man who rode a motorcycle and drank hugely and dabbled in the occult and fathered children and quarreled with everyone, and who yet found time to produce, under his borrowed name, a body of song that ranks among the loveliest in all of English music, and to do serious scholarly work that saved priceless old music from being lost forever. The contradiction was the man, and it could not hold. His finances were a ruin, his creative well seemed to him to be running dry, and the black moods that had always dogged him grew blacker. When he was found gone in his London flat, the circumstances were such that some wondered whether it had been a terrible accident rather than a decision. But the weight of the evidence, and of his despair, pointed to his own hand. He was only 36, and he left behind the tantalizing question of all the beauty he might still have made. The exquisite music he made under his borrowed name has long outlived the scandal and the sorrow of the man who made it, sung and played with love by those who may know nothing of the divided soul behind it. He rests here now, the divided soul who left behind such beauty. Let us travel now to the Rose Hill Cemetery in Bloomington, Indiana, to the grave of Ross Lockridge, Jr., an author destroyed by the very triumph that should have crowned him. Lockridge poured years of his life into a single, enormous, magnificent novel, a sprawling epic of American life that became, upon its publication, the literary sensation of its year. A #1 bestseller, a book club selection, the winner of a great prize, and the basis for a lavish Hollywood film. He had achieved, at a stroke, everything a writer could dream of. But the years of obsessive labor, the crushing pressure of that sudden fame, and the fear of never again matching it, combined with a deepening depression to overwhelm him, and just 2 months after his great success, at only 33, he took his own life. He was buried here in his Indiana hometown. He was a small-town Indiana man of prodigious brilliance and boundless ambition, and he labored for years, obsessively, at a single vast novel meant to capture the whole soul of 19th century America in the events of one symbolic day, pouring into it everything he had, until the effort had all but consumed him. And when the book appeared, it was a triumph beyond any young writer's dreams, topping the bestseller lists, chosen by the great book clubs, garlanded with prizes and Hollywood money, hailed as a possible great American novel. But the very completeness of the triumph seems to have unmoored him, for the years of feverish work had left him exhausted and depressed, and now he was gripped by a terror that he had spent himself utterly, that he could never write anything to equal it, that there was nowhere to go but down. Only 2 months after the greatest success a writer could know, at just 33, and the father of 4 young children, he took his own life. His triumph had a particular cruelty built into it, for the very qualities that made him great, the perfectionism, the boundless ambition, the total investment of the self in the work, were also the qualities that left him with nothing in reserve when the work was done. He had climbed a mountain that had taken years and nearly all his strength, and standing at the summit, garlanded with every honor, he could see only the long descent ahead and the impossibility of ever climbing so high again. His family watched, bewildered and helpless, as the man who had every reason for joy sank instead into a paralyzing darkness, unable to eat or sleep or take pleasure in his success. Decades later, his own son would write a searching, loving biography, trying to understand the father he had lost when he was a small boy. And in doing so, he gave the world a portrait of just how mercilessly this illness can strike, even at the moment of greatest triumph, sparing no one, however blessed they seem. He rests here now, the author whose dream came true and could not save him. Let us travel now to the Zenrin-ji Temple, in the city of Mitaka, near Tokyo, to the grave of Osamu Dazai, one of the most beloved and tragic writers in all of Japanese literature. Dazai gave voice, like no one before him, to the despair and alienation of his troubled age, and his dark, confessional novels. Above all, the story of a man who feels himself disqualified from being human, have spoken to the loneliness of generation after generation of young readers, who cherish him still. His own life was a turbulent succession of crises and sorrows, mirrored in the anguished honesty of his fiction. In the summer of 1948, at 38, he took his own life. He was laid to rest here in Mitaka, near the grave of an earlier literary master he had revered. He was the defining literary voice of Japan's shattered post-war years, a writer of raw, confessional, darkly humorous fiction that laid bare the alienation and self-destruction of his age with an honesty that was almost unbearable and yet somehow consoling, so that readers who felt themselves outcasts found in his pages a companion who understood. His masterpiece, The Confession of a Man Who Feels Himself Fundamentally Disqualified from Human Life, remains one of the best-loved novels in his country, pressed into the hands of the lonely and the searching by each new generation. But the despair he wrote of was his own, and his life was a chaos of addiction, failed relationships, illness, and earlier brushes with death, a long unraveling that his art transmuted into beauty even as it destroyed him. In the summer of 1948, at 38, he took his own life, and was laid to rest near a master he had loved, mourned by a nation of readers. He came from a wealthy and prominent family but felt himself an outsider from the beginning, racked by guilt over his privilege and by a temperament that could find no comfortable place in the world, and again across his short life, he was drawn toward death, in earlier attempts and in a chaos of drink and drugs and doomed love affairs that he chronicled with pitiless honesty in his fiction. And yet there is a strange warmth and even humor in his darkest books, a tenderness toward human weakness that is precisely why the lonely and the suffering have loved him so fiercely for so long, feeling in him a friend who will not judge them because he shares their affliction. His masterpiece has never gone out of print and is read by the young of his country as a kind of secret companion. In the early summer of 1948, at 38, he took his own life together with the woman he loved, and a nation's readers mourned the voice that had spoken so truly for the lost. To this day, young readers discovering his work feel that he is speaking directly and only to them, and in that strange intimacy across the years lies both the greatness of his art and the depth of the sorrow from which it was wrung. He rests here now, the voice of despair whom the lonely still hold dear. Let us travel now to the hills of Piedmont, in northern Italy, to the resting place of Cesare Pavese, counted among the greatest Italian writers of the 20th century. Pavese was a poet, a novelist, and a translator of genius who opened Italy's eyes to the literature of America, and whose spare, melancholy fiction captured the loneliness of the modern soul with unforgettable power, winning him the highest literary honor his nation could bestow. But that acclaim, arriving only months before the end, could not touch the profound isolation at the center of his life, a loneliness deepened by unhappy loves and by a lifelong sense of not belonging. In the late summer of 1950, at 41, in a hotel room in Turin, he took his own life. He was carried home to the Piedmont hills of his childhood. He was a giant of his nation's letters, a poet of stark and haunting beauty, a novelist who caught the ache of modern loneliness as few ever have, and a tireless translator and editor who single-handedly did much to introduce the great American writers to Italian readers, reshaping his country's literature in the process. In the last year of his life, he was awarded the highest literary prize Italy could give, the crowning recognition of a brilliant career. And yet none of it reached the frozen loneliness at his core, a sense of isolation that had shadowed him since boyhood and that his unhappy loves only sharpened, a conviction that he was somehow shut out from the ordinary human warmth that others seemed to share. Only weeks after his great honor, in the late summer of 1950, at 41, alone in a hotel room in Turin, he took his own life, leaving behind a diary of extraordinary and heartbreaking self-knowledge. He was carried home to the hills where he had been a boy. He had kept for years a private notebook of astonishing depth and candor, a running meditation on writing and living and the loneliness that never left him. And in its final pages, written in the days before the end, he set down with terrible clarity his sense that he had come to the limit of what he could endure, that the recognition he had craved had arrived only to reveal its own emptiness. He was a man who had given his country a literature and had translated the great voices of another, who had fought bravely against tyranny in his youth and built a towering body of work, and who had, by any outward measure, every reason to feel his life a success. But the warmth of ordinary human belonging had always eluded him, and a final disappointment in love seems to have removed his last handhold. He checked into a modest hotel in the city where he worked, and there, at 41, he took his own life, leaving his diary as a last, unbearably honest testament. He rests here now, the great writer whom fame could not console. Let us travel now to the Mount Holly Cemetery in Little Rock, Arkansas, to the grave of John Gould Fletcher, a distinguished poet who brought the highest honors home to the American South. Fletcher was a restless and searching spirit, an Arkansas man who spent his youth as an expatriate among the great poets of Europe, becoming a leading figure in an important new movement in poetry, and who returned at last to become the first poet of the South ever to win the Pulitzer Prize. But he was afflicted throughout his life by a severe depression that no amount of achievement or homecoming could lift, a darkness that returned again and again across the years. In the spring of 1950, at 64, it took him at last. He was buried here in the city of his birth. He came from an old and prominent Arkansas family, but he spent the restless years of his young manhood far away, an American expatriate among the experimental poets of London and Paris, where he threw himself into the daring new movement that was remaking English verse, stripping it down to hard, clear, vivid images. He published prolifically, corresponded with the great modernists of his day, and in time became the first poet of the American South ever to be awarded the Pulitzer Prize, a homecoming of honor. But for all his achievement, he was a melancholy and tormented man, plagued across his whole life by a recurring depression that no success could dispel, and that grew heavier as he aged, returning him again and again to the edge. In the spring of 1950, at 64, back in the Arkansas city of his birth, it overwhelmed him at last, and he took his own life. He was buried there among his ancestors. He had been, in his youth, a figure of real importance in the ferment of modern poetry, one of the Americans who helped ignite a revolution in verse from the cafes and drawing rooms of Europe, and though his own reputation would later be overshadowed by more famous names from that circle, his influence was real, and his best work admired by those who knew it. In middle age, he came home to the South he had left, and there won the great prize that made him, for a time, a celebrated figure in his native state, a poet laureate of his region. But none of it touched the melancholy that was woven into his very nature, a depression that had troubled him since his youth, and that deepened, rather than lifted, with age and honor and homecoming, so that even surrounded by recognition he felt himself alone with his darkness. In the spring of 1950, at 64, that darkness at last overwhelmed him, and he took his own life in the city where his life had begun. He rests here now, the honored poet who could not outrun his sorrow. Let us travel now to the Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California, to the grave of Grant Withers, a handsome leading man of early Hollywood undone by his own fading star. Withers was a tall, dashing actor who broke into pictures at the end of the silent era and became, for a time, a popular romantic lead, a familiar face in headlined features, well liked in the film colony and a friend to some of its biggest names. But as the years passed, his star dimmed, and the leading roles gave way to villains in low-budget pictures and small parts on television, and his personal life, marked by a string of failed marriages, brought him little comfort. Worn down by professional decline and private disappointment, in the spring of 1959, at 54, he took his own life, leaving a note of apology. He had come to Hollywood a strapping, good-looking young man from Colorado, and in the last years of the silent films and the first years of sound he found real success, a virile and likable leading man headlining feature after feature, moving in the highest circles of the film colony, even eloping, briefly and famously, with one of the great young stars of the day. For a time the future looked bright, but his kind of stardom proved fragile, and as the 1930s wore on his roles grew smaller and meaner, the leading parts giving way to a long, grinding career as a heavy in cheap westerns and serials and, at the end, bit parts on television. His many marriages brought him little lasting happiness, and the slow humiliation of his decline wore away at him. Until, in the spring of 1959, at 54, worn out and despairing, he took his own life, leaving behind a note that asked those he loved to forgive him. There is a particular pathos in the slow decline of a leading man, in a face once splashed across posters and magazine covers, reduced, year by year, to smaller and meaner roles, to the villain in a cheap serial, to a few lines on a television show, and he lived that decline in full public view over 3 long decades. He remained, by most accounts, a genial and well-liked man, a familiar face around the studios, and a loyal friend to the powerful stars who kept finding him small parts out of affection. But affection could not restore what time and changing tastes had taken, and it could not mend a private life that had come apart through a series of failed marriages. The accumulated weight of professional humiliation and personal loneliness bore down on him until he could carry it no longer. And in the spring of 1959, at 54, he took his own life, leaving a note asking the forgiveness of those he feared he had let down. He was laid to rest among the stars of the town that had made and unmade him. His is the quiet tragedy of the almost forgotten, the star whose light dimmed so gradually that the world scarcely noticed until he was gone, and it stands for the many others like him whom Hollywood raised up and then let quietly fall. He rests here now, the fallen leading man who asked forgiveness at the last. Let us travel now to the Thiers Cemetery, on the southern edge of Paris, to the grave of Paul Celan, widely regarded as the greatest poet of the German language after the Second World War. Celan was a survivor of the greatest horror of the century, a man whose parents were murdered in the camps and who himself endured the machinery of that genocide, and out of that unspeakable suffering he wrought poetry of shattering power, above all a single, searing masterpiece that remains perhaps the most profound poem ever written about the Holocaust. But the trauma never released him, and the grief and the memory pressed down upon him across all the years that followed, deepening into an inescapable despair. In the spring of 1970, at 49, in the city of Paris, he took his own life. He was buried here at Thiers. He was born into a German-speaking Jewish family in a corner of Europe that the war would obliterate, and he survived what his parents did not, enduring forced labor while they were murdered, carrying out of that abyss a wound that would never close and a determination to write, in the very language of the murderers, poetry that the horror could not be allowed to silence. And write it he did. Poems of shattering, compressed, almost unbearable power, chief among them a single early masterpiece that has become perhaps the most famous poem ever written about the destruction of the Jews, a work of terrible and haunting beauty. He settled in Paris and won the highest honors his art could give. But the past would not release him, and the grief and the guilt of the survivor pressed ever harder as the years passed, deepening into a darkness beyond reach. In the spring of 1970, at 49, he took his own life in the city that had become his home. His great early poem, with its terrible hypnotic refrain drawn from the daily reality of the death camps, did something no one had thought possible, finding a way to speak in art of an atrocity that seemed to render art itself impossible, and it made him, almost against his will, the poet of the Holocaust, a role that both defined and haunted him. His later poetry grew ever more compressed and difficult, language broken down and remade under the pressure of what it was trying to hold, as if ordinary words could no longer bear the weight of his experience. He was a survivor carrying the unbearable knowledge that he had lived while his mother and father and a whole world had died. And that knowledge, that survivor's grief and guilt, tightened its grip on him with the passing years, resisting every comfort. He had, at the end, retreated deep into himself, and in the spring of 1970, at 49, he took his own life in Paris, leaving a body of work of almost unbearable moral weight. He rests here now, the poet who gave voice to the unspeakable and could not lay it down. Let us travel now to the Grove Hill Memorial Park in Dallas, Texas, to the grave of Chris Von Erich, the youngest and most fragile of a wrestling family, marked by almost unimaginable tragedy. Chris was the smallest of the famous Von Erich brothers, and more than anything in the world he longed to follow his powerful siblings into the ring and share in their glory. But his body, weakened by illness and by the medicines meant to treat it, was never strong enough, and injury after injury dashed his dream, and he had already endured a grief no young man should, watching several of his adored brothers die one after another. Broken-hearted and unable to bear the losses or his own frustrated hopes, in the autumn of 1991, at just 21, he took his own life. He was laid to rest here beside the brothers he had loved and lost. He was born into what should have been a charmed and golden family, a dynasty of powerful, handsome, adored wrestling brothers who filled arenas and thrilled millions. And from his earliest years, he wanted nothing more than to be one of them, to stand in the ring beside his heroes and share in the family glory. But his small frame and his fragile health betrayed that dream at every turn. For illness and the harsh medicines that treated it left his bones brittle and his body weak, and injury after injury drove him from the ring he loved. And as if that private heartbreak were not enough, he was made to watch, still only a boy and then a young man, as his beloved brothers died one after another in a cascade of tragedy that seemed almost supernatural in its cruelty. Grief-stricken, and despairing that he could never be what he had longed to be, in the autumn of 1991, at just 21, he took his own life. He was laid to rest beside the brothers he had followed in life and now followed in death. The story of his family has become one of the most famous tragedies in all of sport, a tale so relentlessly sorrowful that people spoke of a curse, of a proud father, and a whole nation of fans watching helplessly as one magnificent, doomed young man after another was lost, several of them to the same darkness that would finally claim the youngest and gentlest of them all. He was the runt of that golden litter, the one whose body would not cooperate with his dreams, and there is something almost unbearably poignant in his lifelong yearning to be as strong and as celebrated as the brothers he idolized, and in the illnesses and injuries that made it impossible. When the brothers he loved began to die, the losses fell upon a spirit already fragile with disappointment, and he could not withstand them. Decades later, the whole heartbreaking saga of his family would be told on movie screens to a new generation, who wept for the beautiful, broken brothers, and above all, perhaps, for the youngest, who wanted only to belong. He rests here now, the youngest brother, gathered home at last. Let us travel now to the Pinner New Cemetery in London, to the grave of screaming Lord Sutch, one of the most colorful and beloved eccentrics that British music and public life ever produced. Sutch was a pioneer of theatrical shock rock, a wild showman who recorded with some of the greatest musicians of his age. And he was famous too, as the founder of a gloriously absurd political party, contesting a record number of elections with a joyful, mischievous nonsense that made the whole nation smile. He seemed the very picture of irrepressible fun, but behind the outrageous, grinning showman was a man who suffered from a deep depression, one that grew unbearable after the death of his beloved mother, to whom he had been devoted. In the summer of 1999, at 58, that hidden darkness overcame him. He was one of the great characters of British life, a towering, top-hatted, wild-haired showman who had helped invent the very idea of theatrical horror and rock and roll, leaping from coffins and brandishing props in performances that thrilled and scandalized audiences, and who recorded, along the way, with an astonishing roster of the finest musicians of his era. And in his second act, he became a beloved national institution of a different kind, founding a gloriously silly political party and standing, again and again and again, in election after election, a grinning, good-humored jester, puncturing the pomposity of public life and delighting the whole country. But the man behind the laughter was not always laughing, for he battled a serious depression for much of his life, a darkness that closed in with terrible force when his mother, with whom he had lived and to whom he was devoted, passed away. In the summer of 1999, at 58, undone by grief, he took his own life, and a nation that had laughed with him mourned. For nearly 4 decades, he was a fixture of British life, an irrepressible presence forever popping up where he was least expected, in a wild stage show or on a ballot paper, always in his trademark top hat and leopard skin finery, always grinning, always ready with a joke, a man who seemed to have appointed himself the official court jester of an entire nation, and who performed the role with boundless energy and evident joy. He gave people permission to laugh at the self-important and the powerful, and they loved him for it across generations. But the endless performance concealed a private man of real sensitivity and real sadness, prone all his life to depression. And when the mother he had lived with and adored passed away, the loss struck at the very foundation of him, and the grinning public mask could no longer hold back the grief behind it. In the summer of 1999, at 58, alone with his sorrow, he took his own life, and a startled, saddened nation realized how little it had known the man behind the laughter. He rests here now, the laughing showman who carried a hidden grief. Let us travel now to a quiet cemetery in Connecticut, to the grave of Charles Rocket, a sharp and gifted comedian whose promise was never quite fulfilled. Rocket was a quick, handsome, versatile performer who seemed on the very edge of major stardom when he joined the most famous comedy show on television. And though that particular chapter ended in disappointment, he built a long and respectable career as a character actor, a memorable presence in hit films and popular series, admired by those who worked with him. But the great success once predicted for him never fully arrived, and beneath the wry, confident exterior, he struggled with a depression that few around him fully understood. In the autumn of 2005, at 56, he took his own life. He was laid to rest in the quiet of Connecticut. He had arrived in the public eye with a bang, a quick-witted, matinee handsome young performer chosen for the cast of the most celebrated comedy showcase on television. And for a moment it seemed he might become its breakout star. That chapter ended badly and abruptly, but he was too talented to disappear, and he built instead a long and busy career as a character actor, turning up in beloved comedies and dramas on screens large and small, his sardonic charm and sharp timing making him a welcome presence in film after film, admired by everyone who worked alongside him. And yet the towering stardom that had once seemed within his grasp never quite arrived, and the disappointment of that, together with a depression he kept carefully hidden behind a cool and confident manner, weighed on him more heavily than anyone around him knew. In the autumn of 2005, at 56, that hidden weight became too much, and he took his own life. His story is a familiar and painful one in his profession. The tale of a performer marked early as a future star who never quite crosses that final threshold, who spends a long career as a respected and busy working actor, rather than the celebrity everyone once predicted, and who must reckon, quietly, with the gap between what was promised and what arrived. He handled it, outwardly, with grace and good humor, earning the genuine affection of casts and crews across dozens of productions, a reliable, versatile, welcome presence who could play the smarmy villain or the comic foil with equal ease. But the disappointment was real, and so was the depression beneath his cool exterior, an illness he shared with few and fought largely alone. In the autumn of 2005, at 56, it defeated him at last. Those who had worked with him and laughed with him were left stunned, mourning a talent and a kindness they had perhaps taken for granted, and grieving the private pain they had never seen. He rests here now, the gifted comedian of the promise unfulfilled. And so, we come to the final grave of our long and tender journey, and it belongs to a beloved old man who faced his ending with a quiet, heartbreaking dignity. Let us travel to the high desert country of New Mexico, to the resting place of Richard Farnsworth, one of the most cherished character actors Hollywood ever knew. Farnsworth had lived an extraordinary life, spending decades as a rodeo rider and a movie stuntman, doubling for the greatest stars in the business, before he stepped in front of the camera himself and revealed, late in life, a gift for gentle, soulful acting that made him one of the most admired actors of his time, and, at nearly 80, the oldest man ever nominated for the highest honor his profession could give, for a tender film about an old man's last journey. He was, by every account, one of the kindest and most beloved figures in the industry, but he was stricken with a terrible and painful cancer, one that was slowly robbing him of the mobility and the independence he treasured. And rather than let the disease take him slowly and rob him of himself, this proud, gentle old cowboy chose to meet his end on his own terms. In the autumn of 2000, at 80, he was laid to rest in the western country he loved. His had been a Hollywood life like almost no other, begun not before the cameras but behind the action. For he spent some 3 decades as a rodeo, cowboy, and then a movie stuntman, riding and falling and crashing for the greatest stars in the business, an anonymous master of a dangerous craft. And then, astonishingly, in his 50s and 60s, he stepped into the light as an actor and revealed a screen presence of such warmth, such gentle, soulful dignity, that audiences and critics fell in love, showering him with acclaim and, at last, a nomination for the highest award his new profession could offer, given for his luminous performance as an old man making one final, halting journey to make peace with his brother. He was, everyone agreed, as kind and gracious a man as the industry had ever known. But cancer came for him, painful and relentless, threatening to take from him piece by piece the strength and the independence he cherished above all. And rather than be diminished, this proud old horseman chose to ride out on his own terms. At 80, with his dignity intact, He was beloved not for any grand ambition but for his gentleness, his decency, his old-fashioned cowboy courtliness, qualities that shone through every role and that made everyone who met him love him. And so there is a peculiar tenderness, rather than only sorrow, in his ending. For his was not the despair of a mind lying to itself about the worth of a life, but the clear-eyed choice of a dying man, determined not to be slowly stripped of everything that made him himself. He chose his moment while he was still whole, and those who loved him, though they grieved, understood. He was laid to rest in the wide western country that had always been his true home. He rests here now, the gentle old cowboy who left with his dignity whole. And so, friends, our long and tender walk among these 30 souls comes to its close. We have wandered from a grieving young painter in the Paris of a century ago to a comedian of our own recent years, across the whole of the modern age and half the countries of the earth. And at nearly every grave we have found the same heartbreaking truth, that a gifted and beloved human being was overtaken by a darkness that told them cruel and untrue things about the worth of their lives. Not one of those things was true. Every soul we have visited across these 2 nights was loved and left the world richer and more beautiful than they found it, and would have had so much more to give had the illness that took them only loosened its grip. That is the hardest part of all these stories, and it is also, if we let it be, the most important lesson, because the darkness that took them still moves through the world, and it still tells the same lies, to the famous and the unknown alike, and it may even, on its worst days, whisper to someone hearing my voice right now. So let me say to you, as plainly and as gently as I can, that if you have ever heard those whispers, they are lying to you. Your pain is real, but it is not the truth about your life, and it is not forever, and you are not a burden, and the world is immeasurably better for your being in it. Reach out to someone you trust, to a doctor, to one of the kind voices waiting at the other end of a helpline, for help is real and it works. And so many people who once stood in the darkest of places are alive and glad today that they held on. Do it for yourself, and do it, if you must, in memory of these 30 beautiful souls who could not, so that their stories might yet save a life they will never meet. Remember them, then, not for how they left us, but for the light they left behind, the paintings and the poems and the stories, the songs and the laughter and the quiet dignity. There is a reason we walk these hard roads together, you and I, and it is not to wallow in sorrow. It is because remembering these souls, and speaking plainly about how they suffered and how they died, is itself a kind of quiet medicine, for it drags the old darkness out of the shadows where it does its worst work, and holds it up to the light where it is weaker. For most of human history, these deaths were hidden, or whispered about, or wrapped in shame, and that silence cost untold lives. Because a person who believes their pain is unspeakable is a person who suffers it utterly alone. So when we say these names aloud, and grieve these losses openly, and refuse to look away, we do something quietly powerful. We break the silence that the illness depends upon to survive. Let that be the gift we carry away from these 30 graves, a little more courage to speak, and to listen, and to ask the people we love how they truly are, and to sit with them in their darkness without flinching, and to let them sit with us in ours. The kindest and bravest thing any of us ever does is often nothing more than staying, refusing to leave someone alone with the lie. Rest well, dear ones, all 30 of you, adored in your day and adored still, and never ever the burden the darkness told you that you were. And rest well to you, my companions, who walked this tender and difficult road beside me and did not look away. Be gentle with one another, and be gentle with yourselves, and until we walk together again, good night.